My name is hi. My name is Mike Scavidi. I'm part of the strategic accounts team at JNUC Software, and I'd like to introduce Steve Wood of the Integer Group, who's going to give us a great presentation on imaging. So, Steve, take it away.
Good morning. So, as Mike said, we're going to talk about imaging a little bit. We're going to talk about unwrapping the imaging enigma. I am from the Integer Group in Dallas. We're a shopper marketing, retail shopper marketing ad agency with offices in Denver, our headquarters, Des Moines, and offices around the world. So, our agenda for today, we're going to take a little bit of past, present, and future. We're going to talk a little bit about the background of imaging. We'll talk about some tools that we can use with imaging. We're going to talk about the JAMF ways. How do we use the Casper suite to image computers? And then we'll look through a workflow and eventually get into our future discussion of imaging. Before we do that, just a little bit of housekeeping. I haven't seen it here yet, but I've been told there is bacon. There's bacon here somewhere, even the illustrious bacon turtle. I think there's even a quadruple bacon cheeseburger that's bigger than an iPhone 6 Plus, because of course we all love bacon. And I do have it on good authority that we are getting a parting gift tonight at the party. Who's going to the party tonight? All right. So I have it on good authority that we are going to walk away with our own bacon grooming kit, because everybody needs bacon lip balm and bacon soap, and of course bacon toothpicks to pick the bacon bits out of our teeth when we're done. So, all right, enough with the fun. Let's jump in. How many people have been managing Macs for less than a year? More than a year, about 2 to 3. Okay. How many are crossovers from the Windows world? Okay. How many of you have no idea what imaging is? Okay, we're done. So thanks for coming. No. So like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about background of imaging, where imaging started, or not really where it started, but some ideas about imaging, some terminology that we all kind of heard and maybe don't know. So let's jump into our handy dandy time machine, and we'll take a little bit of a trip back in time and talk about imaging. So way back in the days of the Performa and the Quadra, back in the days of OS 7, OS 8, OS 9, we would take our machine, we'd find one machine that we'd want to use as our master machine. We'd sit down in front of that machine, we'd make sure the OS was loaded, we'd load all our apps, we'd get rid of extensions and control panels that we didn't want people to use. We'd set our web browser settings when we finally did have web browsers. And then we would boot that machine off of a good old SideQuest drive. We'd copy the system folder and the applications and everything to that SideQuest drive. And then we'd run around to every single machine that we had in the place. We'd boot it off that same SideQuest drive. And then we would copy everything over to that machine with that erased hard drive. And then we would bless the system, and away we go. And we had ourselves a computer that was ready to go. So this was the first evolution of fat imaging, or monolithic imaging. This is how we did it. We had no tools for, we didn't really have a lot of tools for doing network restores or anything like that, so we ran around with our handy dandy SideQuest. Well, then after a few years, Apple came out with OS 10. And with OS 10, we kept up that fat imaging. We would pick that one Mac, usually the best Mac we had in the shop, the Mac Pro, or if we were deploying laptops, the MacBook Pro, or the PowerBook G4, PowerBook, the 12-inch, whatever one it was. And we would load the machine up, just like we did with OS 8, OS 9. We'd load the machine up, get all our apps on it, all our settings, that employee manual that HR wanted you to have on it, the proxy settings. We would boot the machine off an external drive, image it using disk utility, and then we'd walk around with that hard drive, and we would use disk utility to deploy to our machines. And then people like Mike Bombich wrote tools like NetRestore. How many people remember NetRestore? Great tool, great tool. NetRestore gave us that ability to now deploy over the network using NetInstall. It was a great tool that Mike wrote. Mike wrote a couple other great tools, Carbon Copy Cloner. And so that was our first real network restore capability with the Mac. Now, the problem with fat imaging, though, is that whenever there's a change, whenever we have to change an application, what do we have to do? Well, we've got to sit down in front of that machine again. We've got to redo all of it and spend hours loading software. Back then, it was inserting DVDs or CDs because the software didn't come in DMG files. And then we had to recreate that disk image, scan it for restore, and then put it back onto our hard drive ready to deploy. And so when you had applications, people deploying Final Cut Pro or the full Adobe suite, full master suite, those images, those fat monolithic images would grow to be 10, 20, 30, 60 gigs or more. And so it was a time-consuming process. And of course, whenever there was a new OS or whenever there was hardware, because we've never ever been forked by Apple, right? Whenever a new machine comes out, what happens? We have to do it all over again because the OS that we have, even though it's the same version, doesn't boot. Uh-oh. As if we got forked. There we go. All right, Bill, what am I doing wrong? All right, we'll do it this way. So, forked by Apple, right? So we'd have to do that whole process over again. Well then, as we moved forward, let's try this one more time. As we move forward with the OS, we had tools that came out like RadMind, tools like Monkey, tools like LandRev, Altiris, and of course, the reason we're here, Casper, that gave us the ability to do something called modular imaging. With modular imaging, we were able to skip the process of sitting in front of a machine for hours at a time loading software, and instead, we could build these build trains where when something changed, we just swapped that one item out in this build chain. Okay, so in Casper parlance, in Casper imaging with your configurations, all you're doing is just switching out a package or switching out that OS. And so this is what it looked like. We'd have all these apps, the OS, we'd have our applications, ourplists, our preferences, settings. And then whenever we had that change, like an OS change, or perhaps the creative department decided that it's okay now to deploy Creative Cloud after 2 years because we've tested it, all we had to do was switch those two items. We switch the OS, we switch out the Adobe suite, and we're good to go. We don't have to sit down for hours and rebuild that image. Our management software, Casper, Monkey, whatever it is going to take care of deploying that software in the configuration that we choose. This is what, so in Casper parlance, this is what that would kind of look like. So Casper imaging, real quick note, the slide deck and all the notes, the resources, I've got a link at the end so you don't have to furiously scribble to try and get this or try to read this by squinting. So in this case, we've got our OS up there, we've got all our applications, we might have printers and dock settings, things like that. The creative department decides that they're no longer going to use CS6, so we're going to deploy Creative Cloud. And so all we have to do is just take CS6 out, we drop in our Creative Cloud packages. In this case, we're only deploying Acrobat, InDesign, and Illustrator, and we're done. We save that in Casper Admin, and now that configuration is changed. We don't have to sit for hours. We don't have to image a machine and then capture that image. We're done. We can now go about imaging our computers. You're obviously going to have to build those packages anyway because you're going to deploy them with policies to people. So that work, regardless, has to be done, but we don't have to re-image. Then as Apple stopped putting a lot of the cruft and stuff into their OS, about 10.6, people as admins, Mac admins, started getting more confident in the image that was coming directly from Apple. And so we started thinking about, why am I erasing the hard drive to put the OS back on to then load my images or my packages? And so we started looking at thin imaging or hybrid imaging. All we're doing in this case is we're just taking the OS out of that modular build method and just deploying packages and settings and preferences. And so in Casper admin, this is what that might look like. You notice there's no OS in there, it's just packages. We don't have to deploy that OS because we're just going to leave that OS on the machine. And then there's another way to do it, and that's with just one package that calls a first boot script that then handles everything through script. Everything from setting up your date, your time, turning off IPv6, turning off iCloud, and then deploying through policies the different software packages. And I'll show a workflow of this as we get further in. So, real quick review. FAT imaging, we said, was we're going to take a machine that's got everything, got the OS on it. We're going to install all our apps, our settings, our preferences. We're going to capture a disk image of that, and then we're going to walk around with our handy-dandy drive, or we're going to use Casper, because you can still use Casper to deploy FAT images, and we're going to deploy it to those computers. And then we said modular imaging was simply taking the OS out of that process and deploying, modular imaging is including the OS, but doing it without having to create that master machine and imaging that master machine. We just simply install the OS, the applications, preferences, etc., onto the machine, and then using Casper imaging. And so we don't have to spend hours doing that. And then we said thin imaging was just taking the OS out of that process. And so we just deploy our apps, our settings, our plist preferences, things like that, using Casper imaging. As my builds. Got ahead of myself. So what are the steps to imaging? Since we kind of know now what types of images we have, what do we need to do? Well, first of all, we need to boot the machine. We're going to talk about 3 different ways to boot a machine to do this. Once we've got it booted, we need to apply that image, whether it's FAT, whether it's modular, whether it's thin, whatever it is. Once we've done that, we need to verify our machine. And verify simply means we just need to log in, make sure the imaging process worked. We don't have to do it on every single machine, but we should do this on a spot check, maybe 1 every 10 or so. Just make sure things go right. Are my applications on there when I log in? Is my doc set right? Are there anything in the log files that say this failed? Whether that's the JSS log files or whether that's syslog, or if you're doing any other type of logging to the system during the imaging process. Did it go the way I expected it to go? So first off, how are we going to boot the device? I want to know who's driving a tank as their day-to-day vehicle. So, or who makes a boot that's large enough to secure a tank. So we said I said there were 3 ways to boot a device, right? So the first way is NetBoot. We create a NetBoot set that contains Casper imaging. We boot the machine off NetBoot, and away we go with Casper imaging. Second way to boot a device, obviously, is an external drive, whether that's a USB drive or whether that's a FireWire drive or a Thunderbolt drive. Boot the machine off that drive and then use Casper imaging that way to image our computers. And the third way is target disk mode, or TMI, as as Jamf refers to it in the admin guide. Simply boot a machine into target disk mode using another machine running Casper imaging to image the machines. So before we talk about that, I want to take a little bit of a rabbit trail and talk about a couple tools that have been mentioned several times already this week. The first one is Auto Damage by Per Olufsen. Auto Damage is the successor to InstantImage. Who used InstantImage? Okay, quite a couple of you. InstantImage and now Auto Damage gives you the ability to have a never before booted OS image. So when 10.10 came out, you could use Auto Damage to create a DMG file of that OS that has all of the current updates in it, slipstreamed already. That's a Windows term. But has all of the packages, all the updates slipstreamed into it. You can load other packages. You could load Rich Troughton's first boot install package. Whatever you need into the OS, you could slipstream that in, and you now have a DMG file that you can deploy with Casper for redeployment or for modular imaging if you're going to redeploy your OS. So that's what Auto Damage does. The next one was Create User Package, also by Per. Create User Package allows you to create local accounts that can be installed on a machine as a PKG file. And so if you need to create a local admin account that you need hidden, you can use create user PKG to create that, to create a PKG file that will drop that user onto the machine with a UID below 500, because we know that UIDs below 500 are hidden to the user in the user control panel or user syspref pane. And then that way we can have our hidden account for when people lock themselves out of their machine, we can still get on the machine and do work. The last one is Auto Casper NBI by Ben Toms, who's from our very own Jamf Nation community. Ben's giving a talk right here on this stage tomorrow at 2:30. I highly suggest if you're building NetBoot sets for Casper, come to that talk and listen. It's a great tool, and it takes a lot of the time that we spend building NetBoot images away. It's great. We're actually I'll show you a quick demo of it in a few slides. So creating NetBoot sets, there's two ways to do it: the manual way and the automatic way. The manual way is to take an external hard drive, load an OS on it, clean up that OS. And by that I mean get rid of applications you don't need, get rid of the sleep image, get rid of everything that you don't need on that image, so that you can cut down the size. You want it to be as lightweight as possible so that it boots fast when served off a NetBoot server. There's plenty of articles out there about creating minimal OSs and about creating net install NetBoot sets. I reference those in the resources with the actual links to the documents or to the discussions on Jamf Nation about how to do it. The key though is that you want to enable the root user. You want to get Casper imaging on there, set Casper imaging to start at boot. You want to, if you're deploying with a JDS, you want to make sure that you have the SSL cert for JDS in the keychain of that machine, of whichever user you're logged in as. So if you're logged in as the root user, fire up Safari, go to your JDS, accept the certificate. Otherwise, when Casper imaging starts up, you're going to get a nice dialog that says, do you want to accept this certificate? And it will slow down your entire deploy process. Once you've done all that, you're going to capture that OS. You want to make sure it's the highest OS, 10.9.5 when I built these slides, 10.10. The reason you want to do that is because the higher the OS, the more machines you'll be able to boot. Again, when we get forked by Apple, guess what? We've got to rebuild our Auto Casper or our Casper NBI sets with that OS, because then we'll be able to boot the majority of machines that Apple has out there. And then once you've done all that, you want to use System Image Utility to capture that NetBoot set, that NBI. You want to do all of this on the same piece of hardware. So if you're doing this on a Mac Pro, you want to do all of it on that Mac Pro. You do not want to do part of it on the Mac Pro and then boot that Mac Pro in target disk mode and connect it to a Mac Mini to use SIU, because you will get the prohibitory sign when you try to use that NetBoot set. It's probably the #1 thing that I see people make the mistake of on Jamf Nation, is that they'll create it on one machine and then try to they'll set one machine up and they'll try to use a second machine that's different to actually build the NBI. So either do it on an external hard drive or partition the hard drive in whatever machine you're doing this on, just so you don't run into problems. You'll lessen the number of problems that you wind up having doing that. Once you've created that NBI using SIU, you're going to take that and drop it into your NetBoot server in that NetBoot folder, and away you go. You can start imaging all the machines you need to image. So that's the manual process. Sounds pretty complicated, sounds like it takes a lot, and so that's why there's an automatic way to do it using Ben's tool, and that's one of the reasons why I highly suggest you look into it, and if you can, make the session, because it takes less time, much less time. Once you've created your never before booted OS with auto damage, you're going to take that, drop that into Auto Casper NBI. You're going to drop in the Casper imaging application. You'll set your JSS URL. You can set some other settings like date and time, locale if you need localization. You can add packages, you can add certificates, all in Auto Casper NBI. And about 10, 15 minutes later, guess what? You've got yourself a NetBoot set that you can then drop directly into your NetBoot server. Or if you do it on your NetBoot server, it will actually let you save directly to that NetBoot folder. So let's see if I've been good to the demo gods today. We do have a demo of this. We're going to launch Casper MBI. We're going to authenticate with our local username and password, our local admin. Once we've done that, we're going to select that OS. Once we've done that, we'll go select Casper Imaging. We'll set our JSS URL. We can set anything else about the NetBoot settings. We can enable ARD, enable VNC, set the desktop image, set the time, set the locale, and then set certificates. So if we have that JDS cert, we can drop that in here. Any other packages we need, we'll say build. It's going to ask us where to save. We're going to save right into that NetBoot folder, and away we go. And the magic of movies, we've built an image in about 10 seconds. And so we're done. And so that whole process took about 12, maybe 15 minutes tops. I've now got a NetBoot set that I can use to boot any of my machines that will automatically boot up Casper Imaging, and I can start imaging my machines right away. The next method we said was using an external drive, whether that's USB or Thunderbolt drive, Firewire drive if you've got them. Basically, the process is building that manual NetBoot set. We're going to install the OS. We don't have to necessarily clean it up this time because we don't really care how big it is since we're using an external drive. We're not doing this over the network. We'll install Casper Imaging. We do want to enable the root user, enable Casper Imaging to start automatically once we boot off that external drive. And then we boot off the external drive and start imaging away. A couple things to note about manually creating NetBoot sets and also about the external drive is you can install other tools if you need to. So maybe you want to install Drive Genius or Disk Warrior or whatever your GUI tool of choice is or any other tools. You could load those in here so that you now have an IT or a tech drive that not only will be able to do Casper Imaging, but you can also use for testing or for fixing other computers. The next thing we talked about was target disk mode imaging. This is something I had seen demoed when Thunderbolt first came out. Jamf did a webinar and demoed it, and I thought, that's pretty cool. And then when I recertified my CCA earlier this year, in the CCA course, we actually did this, and I thought, wow, that is really slick. You're going to take a computer that is brand new out of the box in the machine. You're going to target disk mode it, holding down the T key. You'll have another computer that has Casper Imaging on it, has access to the JSS, has access to your distribution point, whether it's traditional or whether it's a JDS. You'll connect the machine via Thunderbolt, via Firewire. It's not just Thunderbolt, this can also happen with Firewire. But you'll connect that machine up with Casper Imaging running, and Casper Imaging will image the machine, and once done, you can then hot swap with another machine. So if you have a stack of machines that you need to do, maybe 5 or 10, you can actually hot swap these machines in and out. Casper Imaging will image it, it will wait for the next machine to come, you unplug it, you plug the other one in, and away you go. This is in the Casper admin guide. It is listed under TMI, target mode imaging. So if you're interested in that, make sure that you go take a look at that. There's one other method for imaging that we often overlook and we don't think about, and that's offline imaging. And this is for all those people that have remote sites that maybe have a slow connection, don't have a distribution point in their office, things like that. With offline imaging, you're going to take an external drive or another computer. You're actually going to make it a bootable drive. You will replicate the distribution point locally to that drive. Now, a word of warning about that, it is not selective. So if you have a large distribution point, give yourself plenty of time and plenty of drive storage space, because it's going to replicate everything to that local drive. But what that does for us is it allows us to go out to those remote sites, plug into a computer that we need to image, and image that computer off that local hard drive, never having to go across that slow WAN link, never having to have a connection to the JSS. We just simply can image that computer right there. It does not get enrolled in the JSS, but it's imaged. And so we can then create another package maybe that has a LaunchDaemon that will launch a quick add package once the machine is connected to the JSS, or we can use OTA, over-the-air enrollment, where we send an enrollment invitation to the end user and have them go to the website and enroll the computer. I thought this was cool enough that I did do a demo of this, so hopefully we're good. with the demo guns. We've got our imaging drive, we're booted up off of it. We're going to turn this into a Casper imaging drive. So we will open up the imaging drive. We're going to locate Casper imaging inside our applications folder. One of the caveats is that the Casper imaging application needs to be at the root of the hard drive. So we're going to do that. We're going to copy that to the root of the hard drive. We're going to then add it to the dock. We'll set it to launch at startup. We're good. Now we're going to go launch Casper admin. Once we've launched Casper admin and we've logged into our JSS, authenticate. Once we've logged into our JSS, we're going to go back to the Finder. We're going to find that imaging hard drive, and we're going to drag it right into the sidebar in Casper imaging or Casper admin. Once we've done that, come on. I'm a little slow today. I guess I didn't have my coffee that day. So we'll go back to Casper admin. We're going to select that drive, and we're going to say replicate. And it's going to pull down all of our packages from our JSS and store them locally on that hard drive. And again, through the magic of movies, this only took us a few seconds to do. We'll wait for that Xerox driver to replicate. And now we have a hard drive that we can boot our machines offline and image our machines all day long. And we can create as many of these hard drives as we need. We're going to fire up Casper imaging. And you'll notice that we have our distribution point set to the local hard drive. You'll notice that we have our configurations. So we don't have to have access to the JSS. Matter of fact, it doesn't communicate to the JSS at all. It's all right there on that hard drive. And so now we can image away and let people enroll whenever they get a chance to. So that's offline imaging. So what's your method? I said we'd talk through a workflow. Up until 10.7, I was using primarily modular imaging. I used to do fat imaging back in the day when I first started on Casper. Back in Casper 5 days, I would do fat imaging. But I started doing modular. I'd use Instant Image to create my never before booted OS. I'd erase the drive, place the OS, place all my apps using Casper imaging. With 10.7, I started experimenting with thin imaging. And really kind of at 10.8 really got into it and started doing thin imaging full time. I don't do modular imaging anymore. So stock OS, and I let Casper imaging add all my packages. So the workflow, what do? I image about 50 machines a year. I know that's not a lot. I know a lot of you do thousands. Some of you do hundreds. We are on a lease cycle, so I refresh almost every month at least a few machines. I also have machines that come back in from employees that have left or whatever. But for new machines, what's my workflow? Well, the machine will get received. I'll scan it into a Google spreadsheet that I use just to keep track of my assets when they're received. I then copy that into a pre-stage. I copy the serial number into a pre-stage imaging. How many people are using pre-stage? Just a few. So with pre-stage imaging, you have the ability to basically get Casper imaging to run automatically. So when you do get hundreds or thousands of computers that you're doing at a time, you can create a pre-stage, add all of those serial numbers into that pre-stage, and when you boot that machine up with Casper imaging set to auto run, Casper imaging is just going to go. You don't have to touch it. You don't have to do anything else. Casper imaging is just going to go. And it's going to start imaging your computers right away. Once they're added to the pre-stage, I NetBoot or I boot from USB. This defect, Thunderbolt Ethernet adapter preventing imaging, is the reason that I use USB drives. It is still an active defect as of 9.5.2. I'm not sure if it's fixed at 9.6. This is an Apple issue. It is not a Jamf issue. Not to point fingers, but it is an Apple issue, and I know that Jamf is actively working with Apple to get it resolved, but because of that I use USB hard drives because I get the majority of the machines I deploy are either MacBook Airs or MacBook Pro, 15-inch MacBook Pro Retinas. Once it's booted from US, Casper imaging takes over, puts my post-imaging script on, and then the script adjusts all the settings, adds all my software, and away we go. This is what my pre-stage looks like. You'll notice that it says it's enabled. It's set to image automatically. My computer names, I prefix the name with new just so I can find them. So it's new dash and then the serial number of the machine. And then I choose which config I want to use. For me, that's the 10.9 thin. And then the one package that I have, which is that post install or post image PKG file. And then I've got it scoped to my serial numbers. Again, these slides are all online, so you'll be able to see them better then. The package itself, that one first boot package, all it is, it's set to install on the drive at reboot. That package is simply a LaunchDaemon and a script. And the particulars of that LaunchDaemon are that it's going to go find the script where I hide it. I have a directory that I hide all of my utilities, whether it's Cocoa Dialog or DocUtil. You see where it is. It's in private/var /int for integer. But I hide everything in there. So I'll put images, any icons that I'm using, any helper images we use for Jamf helper, or any scripts that we need to be kept on the system, I'll keep in that folder directory. It's set to run at load, and that's basically it. This gets dropped into library/LaunchDaemons during that package. The script gets dropped into that directory. Once Casper reboots the machine, the LaunchDaemon kicks off, the first boot script runs, and away it goes. A couple points about the script that I want to point out. The first half of the script is everything that does not require a connection to the JSS. So time settings, IPv6, etc. And then the second half is everything that does require the JSS, a connection to the JSS. This bit of code is about halfway down. I did not write this. I got to give Marco and his team at Oxford credit for this. They did an outstanding job. If you haven't seen Marco's presentations on imaging here at JNUC about 2 years ago and again last year, I highly suggest you go back and watch those videos. I've actually got a link to at least one of them in the resources. This script, this portion of the script, basically waits for the enroll.sh file to finish. It checks to make sure that Casper has enrolled the machine in the JSS and that the enroll.sh file is not running. And once that's done, it keeps going. So it just keeps checking and checking and checking until finally it either times out or it makes that connection to the JSS. The next part of the script that I wanted to show is I use smart groups during the first boot process just as a safety net. So not only do the machines, that way I make sure that only the first boot machines, new machines, are the ones that are going to run these policies. So I have a set of policies that are first in a category called first boot, and they're scoped to this first boot group. Once the machines have been added, I drop a dummy receipt, then recon them so they're added to that smart group. Once they're added, then we start installing packages, and I do it using the policy ID, not using custom triggers. Just use the policy ID. You can get the policy ID by looking at the URL whenever you're in your JSS. If you open a policy, there's an ID number, and you can call your policies that way using that ID number. And so here I'm installing iLife and Adium, and I've got a whole bunch of other apps that I install, including the CS6 suite at this time. We haven't moved to Creative Cloud yet. And then at the very bottom, we do some cleanup. We purge the logs to make sure there's no passwords in there. I get rid of that first boot package, get them out of that smart group, fix the permissions on the drive, and then get rid of the post-image plist, that LaunchDaemon, to make sure that it doesn't try to run again. And so then once we've done that, the machine reboots, and I'm back at the login screen, and I'm ready to go. I can log into the machine, I can add more software, I can do whatever I need. No, these machines are not bound to AD at this point. Users cannot log into them because their names, the computer names, are generic. It's new and the serial number. We name all our computers by our usernames. So I do have a demo of this all the way from the NetBoot process through. So we NetBoot the machine. NetBoot is going to fire up Casper imaging right when we get into it. Casper imaging is polling, it's checking the serial number, it's checking to see if it's in a pre-stage or an auto run. It found it in a pre-stage, so it's going to go ahead and run. It's going to do its thing. It's going to drop my package on there for load after reboot. It'll reboot the machine. It'll throw up the Casper lock screen. It's installing that PKG file, and then it's going to reboot. And then on reboot, it's going to throw up my lock screen, which is nice and generic. Thanks, Mike Morales, for this bit of code. And in the background, all of my software, my first boot script was being run, and now I'm back at the login window. So obviously I sped that up. I didn't load a lot of software on there, but all of my software was loaded during that time frame. Chrome, Firefox, all of our settings, whatever. I'm going to go ahead and log into the device now. Remember I said we want to check to make sure everything worked. We're going to open up the applications folder. Again, I kept this one real simple. And we see that Firefox, Flip for Mac, Chrome are installed on the machine. And so this machine's been imaged using NetBoot, using a first boot script, and we're ready to go. So what's left? After I've imaged that machine, what do I have left? Well, software updates. I'll log into a machine, I'll run software updates. At the bottom of that script, I forgot to mention that after all the Casper software, or after all the policies have run, before we do cleanup, I actually do run software update at least one time. The next release or next iteration of the script will get it to run software update multiple times, even if it requires a restart, so that we get all the software and I don't have to log in and do this. But currently what I do is I'll log into the machine as the local admin user. I'll run software updates until I have no more updates. I'll rename the computer when I'm ready to deploy. A lot of times I close machines and put them up on the shelf and wait for deployment. Once I do have a machine, a user that's getting a new machine, I'll rename their old computer, rename this computer, get a recon in, go ahead and bind it to LDAP or bind it to Active Directory. I'll transfer the user data, so I'll log in, I'll use rsync to transfer their data while they're still working. I do that again when I'm ready to actually swap the machines. I'll say, okay, go ahead and log out of your machine. I'll run rsync one more time just to make sure I've got everything. And then I have the user log in. And once they've done that, if they're a laptop user, I have a self-service policy to go ahead and file vault encrypt the drive. And so that's the process for a new machine. Once we're done, the machine is theirs. I take their old machine, and then I go wipe it and install an OS on it and ship it back to the leasing company. But what about redeploy? I have machines that come back mid-cycle because an employee's left or because their computer blew up, wasn't acting right, and I swapped computers on them. Basically, I do a kind of a hybrid modular, if you will. I'll boot from an external drive. I'll choose a redeploy configuration that deploys an auto-damage created DMG file and then drops my first boot package on there, reboot the machine, and away we go. So a lot like the new imaging workflow, the only difference being that I've erased the hard drive and applied an OS onto that machine. This is what that redeploy configuration looks like within Casper Admin. So I said we'd talk about future. What's next? Well, the keynote yesterday kind of stole some of my thunder because to me, the next thing is zero-touch configuration with DEP and Casper. Back in 2006, I was at WWDC, and I saw Pixar give a demonstration of something that they called Metro. Metro was a product that they wrote internally for deployment. Pixar is big on writing their own software. With Metro, they were able to take a machine that was brand new out of the box, barcode it, give it to the end user with a piece of paper in it that said, unpack this box, plug it into the network, start it up and hold down the end key, and your machine will be ready in a few hours. And that's exactly what they did. The IT department didn't really touch the machine other than to barcode it or to asset tag it. All they did was deliver it to the end user. That end user would take it out of the box, plug it in, boot it holding down the end key. The machine would boot. It would not only install all of the packages and settings, but it would actually transfer their user data too, because there was a little bit of a dialogue that the user would have to fill out. Who are you? What extension are you at? Things like that. But it would transfer all of their user data off of their existing machine onto that new machine. Once it was done, it would reboot. It'd be at that login screen. They simply shut it down, shut their old machines down, swap the two, and called IT and said, okay, my old machine's ready to pick up. Now, to me, that is the ideal solution. I'd love that zero touch. If you know Miles Lacey, Miles is the same way. Miles is a big zero touch fan. I don't typically need zero touch in my environment. It's not necessary because I'm a very small environment, but I still think it's pretty cool and I'd love to do that. I'd love to see it happen. In my mind, zero touch with DEP would look like this. We'd order our machines from Apple. Those machines would get shipped. We'd unbox them. We'd scan them into our asset inventory system. We'd asset tag them. We'd deliver it to the end user and let the end user start it up. And through the magic of DEP, they would get enrolled in the JSS and all the applications would deploy down. So I said that the keynote yesterday kind of stole my thunder. The future is now with 1010. So prior to 1010, we weren't able to do this. I have not tested it because I didn't have a DEP machine available last week to test with Yosemite. So I guarantee that next week I will find one of my DEP enrolled machines and be testing this out. But to me, this is the ideal. How great would it be to hand our end users their computers and go, all right, have fun. And just Casper takes care of it for us. And we don't have to do anything except maybe help them transfer their data. Or we tell them to transfer their own data, or we use network home folders. To me, that's great. It then frees us up to do a lot of other things as admins. We don't have to be constantly imaging machines or helping people to do things like that. So this is where I think we're going with the future of imaging, and I'm excited to see where we go with that. So I mentioned resources. This is a few of them. Again, you don't have to scribble these down. Rather than do that, just go ahead and take a gander at that QR code. All of the slide deck is in PDF form. The movies are up there, along with another PDF full of these resources. It's up on my GitHub link. I'm on Jamf Nation all the time. I'd love to help people out, help the community out. That's one of the things I love about Jamf Nation, is that this is a community that loves to help each other out. As they mentioned, a lot of us are getting up here for the first time and giving presentations because that's what it's about. It's about helping other Mac admins out, whether you're just in it or whether you've been doing it for 18 years like I have. That's what the community's about. So if you ever have a question, just post it on Jamf Nation, and if I can answer, I'll help. If not, I'm sure someone else can. So thank you very much.
All right, guys, we got about 16 minutes or so for Q&A. So I guess if you guys want to yell a question or we'll
way back. Way back. I didn't hear the end of it there. So the question was with the DEP program, could I do that through my leasing company? Yes. As long as the only requirement really from Apple is that you purchase from Apple. You cannot purchase from a third party at this time. It has to be purchased directly from Apple. But yeah, I've only done a few machines so far, but the ones that I purchased from Apple, I was able to get into the DEP program, yeah. The follow-up was you have to go through Apple. Yeah, you can't go to CDW or Inside or Mac Mall or anything like that. It has to be Apple Direct. Yeah. First.
Just another note on that is you actually have to be on terms with Apple to do DEP. So your business has to qualify for a terms account with Apple to be able to purchase machines through DEP, and that's actually it can be a very difficult qualification process depending on how big your business is, how much business you've done, how long you've been around.
Yeah, so the follow-up to that was, in case you didn't hear him, you do have to be on terms with Apple for the DEP program. There is quite a bit of a process. You've got to have a DMB number, a Duns & Bradstreet number. You have to apply for it. Apple actually calls you to verify. So there's quite a few steps. So if you're not enrolled in it, look into it, get with your Apple rep or with someone with your Casper TAM, and I'm sure they can help.
Why did you choose to bind after imaging?
The question was, why did I choose to bind after imaging? Primarily because the computer name is set to a generic name. So it's easier to do that than try to change the name in AD afterwards. So. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Talk to me about like what your workflow might look like if, say, I threw in
30% to Windows?
30% of your hard drive has to be devoted.
Okay, so the question was, what's the workflow if 30% of the drive has to be devoted to Windows? I'm assuming boot camp, right? Really, there's no change. I would partition the drive and use WinClone.
I was going to say that's
Yeah.
what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I don't deploy Windows much. I have maybe 4 users that use boot camp, and quite honestly, it's just as easy for me to do it manually. Yeah, yeah.
They're looking at rolling out a one with that. We actually have a Kbox server that handles the Windows imaging side. Now, I'm certain I would have to use WinClone to build a base FS on it, but how would I, or the Windows guy would have to know what version on it, or else I've been running on it for 5 years.
So the follow-up to that was, once I have Windows on there, how would I use KBOD or Altiris or anything else to deploy the Windows side?
Yeah, and sadly our Windows guys, they've been doing thick imaging for the whole time.
So really, if the Windows guys would have to get to a point where they're doing packaging or thick or however, once you could deploy a Windows, get a machine ready, basically do fat imaging, where you would get a Windows image completely done, sysprep it, WinClone it, and then drop that into Casper so that you could then deploy that way. Over here.
First, we need back to his question. I have a boot camp lab that I have to reimage every year, and I found out the hard way that for some reason there's a bug with partitioning if you use Casper to do it, where it doesn't make the Windows volume actually bootable. The way I found around that is a new version of WinClone actually has an option to create your boot camp image as a package file. Yep, and then that actually worked, and I can now actually deploy on boot camp just as a package in the regular Casper flow. So that worked really well for me. And my question is, we imaged about 2,000 machines this year, and I ran into a problem on quite a few dozen of them where they weren't actually enrolled in the certificate from our JSS. We tried to run like recon or another policy, we get an error back saying doesn't have a valid mobile device certificate. And the way I had to go around that was to launch terminal and run like sudo jam enroll prompts, type in my password and stuff, and have it download a new certificate. But I had to do that on dozens of machines. Is there a way to have it check after it's imaged, did it actually get a valid certificate? Can it actually get the profiles right?
So the question boils down to, is there a way to check after you've imaged if the machine has communication to the JSS, a valid cert and things like that? Sure, you could, instead of rebooting at the end of that first boot package, you could put a block of code in there that said, that checked to make sure that it was enrolled, make sure that it had valid communication with the JSS, and then maybe throw either a window up, a dialog window using a LaunchDaemon and Jamf Helper, or the ARD lock screen command, things like that. Yeah, you could absolutely do that. So, were you imaging laptops with Ethernet adapters or?
Actually, the biggest issue I found was on Mac Minis and iMacs over Ethernet. A lot of our wireless laptops were fine, only had about 20 out of 900 that didn't roll properly, but I had entire computer labs with hardwire iMacs and Mac Minis that I had built into machine and didn't roll.
Yeah, I know there's been several discussions on that on the Nation. I know Amanda Wolf, I think she has a defect open for that. Yeah, all I can say is you could probably come up with some code. If you posted that out on the Nation, I'm sure that one of us could help you write that if you needed help writing it. So.
And in the back there.
Hey, sorry, just a couple little clarification points. When the Auto Casper NPI, do you still want to run that on the latest hardware as well?
So clarificate, the question is, do you want to run Auto Casper MBI on the latest hardware? I would, if you can, just because it lessens the chance that there's going to be a problem. That would be a great question to ask Ben tomorrow.
And just on the modular versus imaging, what about non-new machines? Let's say somebody left the company and you're just kind of repurposing. Would you then
So the question was, when someone leaves the company, do I go to modular? That was that last workflow, the redeployment. Basically, I'm erasing the hard drive, applying an OS, and then thin imaging it. So applying my first boot package so that it then thin images. So it's kind of a hybrid. It's a mix of the two.
Just a quick comment about DEP. Just because today you can't buy DEP from a bar doesn't mean in the future you won't be able to. Because DEP is a really good reason to buy new hardware, and Apple really likes to sell new hardware. So they're going to get that work.
Yeah.
We just don't have it right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So the comment for the camera or for the video is that just because today you can't purchase from a VAR or from not from Apple to do DEP doesn't mean it won't. Yeah, absolutely. We don't know what the future of Apple is, just like I didn't know they were going to get DEP to finally work the way we wanted it to work with Yosemite. So things were right.
So if I have a MacBook Air, it's wireless only practically, and set it up, I create the image holder, and there's a bunch of checkboxes. One of them says to basically remove system certificates, system keychains. Now, do you leave it on or off? Because I notice you lose your wireless if you don't remove all the keychains.
So the question was, in Composer, if you build your image and tell it to remove all keychains, you lose your wireless.
Yeah, because it saves it somewhere in the system keychain.
Right.
You don't want to give out a password.
Right.
You want to kind of keep that a secret. So,
There are ways to deploy that key using a PKG file and using the security, I believe it's the security terminal command, right? You can then add that to the rest of your build process. So I'm assuming you're building your OS image and then bringing that into Casper imaging and then deploying the OS image and then all your software. So as one of the software packages, you can have a Wi-Fi config that will deploy that password, or look at configuration profiles. You can do the same thing with config profile.
figure out its profile, doesn't it have to have access to a network?
Yeah, so I would contact your TAM. We've actually got a pretty nifty workflow where you basically download the profile from the JSS, you wrap it up in a DMG, you hide it somewhere on the system where you add it to part of your imaging configuration, and then right at the end we can run a script that just does a profiles-i-f, and that'll install that profile. So if we're removing it when we're using, we'll basically just re-add it at the end, or just make it part of the imaging configuration.
I had a question for the group to be more of how we're doing things. The question is, we're K-12, we do labs. If people in their configuration profiles, when imaging, let's just say we need to have 35 packages installed, do people do it all at the one time of NetBoot and you can guarantee the machine's done, or do they just get an OS on there and use policies to do it after the fact, so you can kind of just move on and it'll cook over the day or overnight? By show of hands, who does it all at the same time, or let the computer do it via policies later?
So the question was for those that have labs that re-image them regularly or each night, do you bake in your config profiles, all your settings, and do a fat image, or do you do the more modular or thin approach where you put the OS on and then allow the config profiles to trickle down overnight? By show of hands, who does it fat, bake it in?
Well, not bake it in, just get an OS on there and then use our GSS via policies, like this lab has this policy. Make sure all this stuff is on the machine, instead of checking all the boxes, all the packages to install at the same time. So let's just say I can get a computer to log in within 8 minutes, but it's not going to have Chrome, it's not going to have Firefox.
Okay.
That stuff's coming down.
So doing the application installs via config profile.
Yeah.
Okay. How many are doing application install via config profile? Couple.
We don't either.
Yeah, a couple people. So.
Is there some reasons you have to, because like certain apps aren't gonna install in the NetBoot environment properly? So, and for, we've got a lot of stuff that runs as first enroll policies that install apps. So
Does that kind of answer it?
Pretty much.
Got a question over here?
When it comes to third-party apps that need licenses like CrashPlay, how do you get it to install with the image? Like, I mean, is it a way that you can image it and the configurations are ready to install without having to add the licenses?
So the question is for applications that require a license, is it licensed at image time or at install time, or do I do it later? Is that right?
For example, if I image a system and I have that program inside the configuration window, after the image is finished, it always has like the stop sign on it, or it doesn't work because it says I need a new license. So is there a way for you not to have to do that?
Yeah, typically whenever I deal with third-party software that requires a license, I'll actually use Composer to snapshot it to figure out where that license is stored. 9 times out of 10, it's stored in a plist file, and so then I'll write a PKG either to drop that plist where it needs to be, or script it to actually write the plist file. Does that make sense? Okay, we have time.
And so, sorry, to follow up to that, there are some applications like ESCO software that's like hardware dependent. You're never going to be able to put it out. Sometimes you go to
You know, the follow-up was that there's some software requires a hardware dongle. Yeah, there.
sorry, not hardware dongle. It's a license file.
Oh, right. License to the hardware itself. Yeah. And yeah, there's, I mean, the Composer method is not always going to work. There's applications that I've had lots of problems with. I would recommend posting that to the nation, because I guarantee there's someone on the nation that has had to deal with that particular piece of software.
For CrashPlan specifically, there's a really good article on Jamf Nation about how to deploy it and have it check in, license, the whole 9 yards once it's already out there. So there's a repackaging process that's already out there.
Yeah, and there's a white paper on that too, I believe. Yeah.
I have a question about the Casper NDI. Do you foresee a limitation of the amount of computers that can simultaneously be booted up? Our previous problem was we could only have 12 machines booted up to that Casper NDI, and it was a crapshoot whether it would finish. So we started using Deploy Studio, had much better life for their NDIs. Is this auto Casper NDI a better NDI when it's stripped down? Will it be able to do 30 NetBoots at the same time?
So the question was, with AutoCasper MBI, would you be able to get over the limit of 12 machines booted at a time? I'd have to defer that to Ben, unless you know.
We've seen for years, AFP, occasionally we'll see some limitations with AFP where we sort of hit that magic number of 10 or 11 or 12, and that's when we start losing connections. We've been investigating it for a while, since we pretty much defer to server.app, and we defer to NetBoot as kind of like the Jamf way, or how we go about it. We've gone and helped and troubleshot. In 10.6 there are some modifications that you can make. It's a little different with each OS revision, but sometimes you can find and modify that hard limit. That might be in AFP, or now it's SMB2.
Anyone else?
At the end of your deployment, what's the average size of your image? One of the problems I run into is I'd love to do more modular imaging, but especially with my labs, I'm higher end, so I have a bunch of labs, I have faculty members that want everything up to the sun. I mean, my largest image right now is about 200 gigs.
Right.
I mean, I haven't yet come across a great way to modularize that, even although I maybe you're close to call package, maybe work. I mean, how large are you generally? Do you see like a tapering off when you're modular? It doesn't seem to work for you.
So the question was, how large is my image typically when deployed? Because I'm using thin and modular, I don't know like how many gigs that is, but the systems are typically, I'd probably guess 30 gigs at most, probably less than that.
Okay, here's your problem.
Yeah.
Every one of those labs.
Yeah, and modular imaging, so, you know, fat, thin, modular may not work in every situation. There may be situations where a fat image is going to work better a lab, for example, if you've got a bunch of apps and you've only got a small window to deploy, a fat image may be better because you're going to be able to block copy that over to the machines. If it's on a gig network, it's going to go a lot faster. So there's advantages to fat. I personally, because I don't have a constraint on how long it takes, I can use modular or thin or whichever method I need. So.
You can also mix the two by, just having your OS and pressing that the OS part, the biggest part, get one copy and then press your copy.
Right, so the follow-up was that you could mix the two where you compress your configuration in Casper admin so that the OS itself is pushed. Compiled, sorry, thank you. Yeah.
It'll be the last one.
All these people with labs and these giant images, your problem is a hardware problem. You need more distribution points. You need it to go faster, get more distribution points. That's the whole point of the distribution point architecture, is that if you have a lab that's constantly being reimaged in these 200 gig images, there needs to be a distribution point in that room.
Yeah.
And going forward, when you start deploying out this stuff, there needs to be caching servers in that room. So this is all just throw hardware at that problem and make it go faster. That's why I have money to do it. Just put it all on software.
Said the entire room.
All right, we want to thank you all for your time here today.
Thanks.